So this is Alexander Calder. He was born to a family of artists in 1898, and his father and grandfather were also very well-noted sculptors. And Calder actually spent his youth living between New England, Arizona, and Southern California because of his father's work. And it was during his childhood that he began to tinker around and start creating objects. So actually among one of his first projects was making clothes and accessories for his sister's dolls. And then as he grew up, he was gifted a studio space in his family's basement where he could actually build objects, and he got a set of tools. And so he really started making these interesting kinetic sculptures from the age of about 11. So actually, even though Calder was a creative child, after high school, he ended up training at the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey, and he graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering. But only a few years into his career, he decided that he was going to leave mechanical engineering and pursue his dreams as an artist. So he moved to New York City and he enrolled in the Art Students League. So while he was there, he actually worked as an illustrator for the National Police Gazette, and he had a variety of assignments illustrating for this paper. And the most influential on him, though, was recording the acts of the Ringling Brothers Circus, which later led him to creating his iconic Calder Circus that's still on view at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. So at the time of Calder Circus's invention, he had moved to Paris to study art, and he began creating these mechanized circus performers and animals that were to be used in this show. So what we now understand as performance art hadn't really been established, but the act of voicing the characters while pulling the levers and cranks to make the figures move really set a precedence for a really interesting and unique viewing experience. So artists like Man Ray and Pablo Picasso and Le Corbusier attended the avant-garde performances in Paris, and has actually established Alexander Calder on the Western art scene. Also, while he was living in Paris, he met and married his wife, Louisa James. And when they got married, Louisa's father actually suggested that he pursue a more serious art form so that way he could support his family. So he was inspired by the artists working around him, and particularly after a studio visit to Mondrian's iconic Paris studio, he was able to see his compositions, and Mondrian had the studio design Leclerc's compositions. So the really colorful rectangular shapes on the wall were intriguing to Calder, and he suggested that even though these shapes on the walls were wonderful, wouldn't they be even more wonderful if they moved? So it was around this time that Calder began to create his famous mobiles, which are the kinetic sculptures that are suspended in the air, and then they're made to move in response to their environment. So in the 1970s, Braniff International Airways approached Calder to paint a 157-foot DC-8 jet, and this skyboard mural was intended to promote South America as a colorful destination continent. So this design reflected on the airplane may have inspired the tapestry that's on display in the Spotlight exhibition, because no doubt Calder began his design process in the studio by painting his cartoons. But when it came down to narrowing down the final composition, he transferred his ideas from paper to model airplanes that were about 3 feet long, and he painted 8 of these miniatures in the process of finalizing the design. And then the airplane, the final airplane that Braniff released, was so popular that the preliminary models that he had painted for the plane's design were actually suspended from the rotunda in the Guggenheim in New York City in 1973, the year this plane was released. So I think that really, it really distinctly celebrates Calder's interests in kinetic art as well as engineering. So the plane, which they called Flying Colors of South America, was a smash hit for Braniff. And it was a part of their fleet that flew to and from South America daily. And it was actually advertised as the first jet to be turned into an original work of art. So the design was intended not only as a way for everyone to see an original Calder piece, but it was a really fashionable way to experience the trending destinations in a style. So it was more of not only just a really cool jet, but it was also a status symbol. And because the first airplane was such a success, Braniff actually commissioned the second jet to be designed by Calder in celebration of the bicentennial of the United States. So the result was a Boeing 727 airplane that was adorned with these rippling blue lines and red lines that are reminiscent of an American flag waving in the wind. And they dubbed this one Flying Colors of the United States. So this mural was one of the final commissions of Calder's lifetime. And actually, after this aircraft retired, it was sold to a film production studio and has been immortalized as the plane that blew up in the 1995 action film Bad Boys that was featuring Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. So in the process of designing this airplane, Calder likely took to paper to imagine his designs first. And this lithograph is like the one that you can see in the spotlight gallery upstairs. So he made an entire series of designs around the Braniff airplanes that could be kind of a hallmark of his later works in the 1970s. So he had actually been commissioned to paint a third aircraft called Flying Colors of Mexico, but he passed away suddenly in 1976 before the plane's designs were completed. So these massive sky murals were some of the final collaborative projects that Calder worked on throughout his extensive career. And although Braniff incorporated Calder's designs into their airplanes, Calder's creative process allowed him to extend this project across mediums. So in this tapestry, the angular shapes may have been inspired by the plane's wings, and the circular objects could have been inspired by the jets. So the colors are certainly reminiscent of the plane that was designed for South American adventures. And another unique aspect of this tapestry, though, is that it melds medieval art forms with contemporary design, modern design. So I keep saying Aubusson tapestries, but I don't think I've gotten into that yet. So they're very historically significant, and they date back as early as the 14th and 15th centuries. So the use of these decorative wall tapestries really prospered in Europe during the Middle Ages. And they were a means, like Louise's rugs, of preserving warmth in large, drafty buildings like churches and castles. So this region of Aubusson, France, gained popularity among weavers due to the local river, which was unusually acidic in nature. And this made the river really good for removing grease from the wools. And then, in addition, of course, it provided water to the weaving workshops. So in 1665, King Louis XIV actually made Aubusson the royal manufactory. So all tapestries that were created for the royal family had to come from this very specific town. So he signed bylaws that regulated the quality of materials as well as the process to ensure that only the highest quality of tapestries came from this region. And over the centuries, the weaving process became exceedingly complex, with some of the images and tapestries having up to 200 separate thread colors. So this resulted in a really heavy, bulky weave that was less appealing visually and took an insane amount of time to actually make. So the Aubusson tapestry revival really began in the 20th century, and it sought to preserve the historic techniques by producing modern textiles using these medieval methods. So this simplified practice implemented coarse weaves that were made out of vegetable-dyed wool on these lower warped looms. So even though the process had been restored to its integrity, it can still take weavers weeks to weave like small squares of these fabrics. So it's a very laborious task. So the result of this revival was a process that's ideal for these simple designs, which was an aesthetic that was really appealing to a modern market. So artists like Calder, Matisse, Miro, and Picasso all turned their designs into Aubusson tapestries. So this tapestry was produced by a manufacturer in the Aubusson region called Canton. So this is where, at this workshop, textiles are still being created as a collaborative project between artists and weavers in the contemporary art market. So weavers are still turning their work into these really beautiful tapestries today. So the simplicity in Calder's designs really made it economical for production, and the boldness of his shapes and colors are, of course, very appealing and aesthetically compelling. He actually was a leading tapestry designer in the 20th century, and more than 80 of his cartoons were turned into these editions of Aubusson tapestries, and they were all woven in editions of 6. But Aubusson is still a mainstay in textile production, and they still are training these very skilled weavers in this medieval tradition. And actually in 2009, Aubusson tapestry was inscribed on UNESCO's representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. So Calder really drew inspiration from all areas of life. So whether it be from his contemporaries or from his travels, he collaborated with both manufacturers and individuals to bring his iconic designs to life. Throughout the years, all of his designs kind of seem to be intertwined, and that's probably because his artistic practice was completely integrated into his life and ingrained in who he was as a person. So his big ideas and vibrant personality allowed him to work with a variety of materials and makers over the course of his extensive career. So here you can see a giant stay wheel that belongs to the city of Hartford, and it's located directly beside the Wadsworth Atheneum in a public square. And it's accompanied by this lovely water feature that mimics the shape of Calder's sculpture that's only turned on in the warmer months, but it is really beautiful. And it's become a landmark of the community, which I'm sure many of his large-scale public sculptures have in their communities. So throughout his life, he was able to create a variety of artworks and work with an impressive amount of materials. And his best-known works are, of course, his mobiles and stay-wheels. But his designs really extended far beyond like metal sculptures and even beyond textiles and works on paper. And then, he even designed concert halls and tapestries. So his creative spirit had a really far reach. And you can still see original stay-wheels in actually 20 American states and 21 countries internationally. So his legacy really lives on, not only in his works that remain, but the Calder Foundation has turned the Calder Home and Workshop in Sachi, France, into a site for artists from across the globe to spend 3 months conducting research and creating art with technical and financial support from the Calder Foundation in New York. So if you guys are ever interested in learning more about Calder and his various artistic endeavors, the Calder Foundation website actually recently, I think during COVID, launched their archives online, and you can see, I believe, like 1,300 of his works are documented there, and over 1,000 historical photographs of Calder and Louisa and their life and his work. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to learn about Calder's designs and how these textiles came about, and I would love to answer any questions